In the summer of 2010, when I was starting my teenage years, my family went on a trip to a nice hotel in the city. I don't remember why we went, but I do remember that some family friends came too and stayed in nearby rooms. I never asked my parents about the reason, but it doesn't matter for the story now. I should say that I get scared easily and always have. I'm a skinny, fragile kid, so I get nervous pretty easily even now. But this time it wasn't just me getting scared for no reason like usual anyway. So the hotel had an unusual design, like the lobby was on the fourth floor, not the first floor, which felt odd to me. So to get to the lobby you had to take the elevator, and you couldn't reach there using the stairs, which would have been good to know before everything else happened. The hotel was built in a square shape. Each floor had a balcony where you could look down into the lobby and cafe area. This meant that if you were walking to your room, anyone on your floor could see you just by stepping out of their room and looking around. I was always scared I might fall over the balcony and drop 8 floors, but the railing were high enough that I didn't worry too much. The first couple of days were fun. My friends and I played cards all day or watched whatever was on TV, and at night we walked around the hotel halls and told ghost stories. But on the third day, though, things got weird. I woke up to loud screaming outside my door. Because of the hotel's design, sounds from the lobby could echo all the way to the top floors. When I went outside to investigate, I saw a girl on the ground with milk and eggs all over her. People were running to her aid, and I overheard several of them telling me to phone 911. It appeared as though the girl was unconscious, possibly having fainted. I looked around the lobby and saw my family and a few friends eating breakfast and watching what was happening, so I decided to go down to join them and find out what was going on. Since the elevator was on the opposite side of my floor, I used the stairs near my room, so it wasn't a big deal. I started down looking for the letter L for the lobby or the number 4 on the wall. And after a few more flights I noticed that there was no door for the 4th floor, and no door for the 3rd or 2nd floor either. At this point, I probably should have turned around, but I didn't want to go back up. I noticed some odd side hallways that led to dark areas with pipes and wires, and I felt curious, but I decided not to check them out right away. I reached the bottom floor. It was a cold, dimly lit room with cinder block walls and concrete floors. In front of me there was a pair of double doors. I paused for a moment, but figured this was just another way to the lobby, so I opened the doors and went in. Behind them was a huge warehouse-like room about the size of a small basketball stadium. The only light came from the stairwell behind me, so I couldn't see much inside. There were stairs stacked and covered in plastic wrap tables along the wall. And in the distance I thought I saw boxes piled up against the wall too, so it was probably the hotel's storage room. I looked around and noticed an elevator at the back of the room, so I started walking toward it. I closed the stairwell door behind me and walked through the dim light. The room felt hot and dusty, like no one had been there for a long time. I pressed the up button, but nothing happened. There was a card swipe next to it. I thought it was probably for employees, only I turned back to the stairwell doors and walked past the chairs and tables along the wall. When I reached the door, I tried to open it, but it was locked. Of course, this is when things started to hit me, and I realized I was stuck in the dark, dusty basement of the hotel. I didn't have a phone because my parents said I couldn't get one until I finished middle school, so I couldn't call anyone, and everyone probably thought I was still in my room, so I started to. I was afraid that no one would be looking for me, so I looked around the brighter parts of the room first before checking the darker ones. It felt like hours, but then I heard a door creak open. It wasn't the stairwell door, but when I stepped out of the second one, I saw a thin, middle-aged man in a lab coat. If I had been 21, I would have been really confused as to why he was wearing a lab coat in a hotel, but I was only 12 or 13 at the time, so I was relieved to see an adult who looked smart. I approached him with tears in my eyes, and he looked surprised to see me, just like you would expect. "What are you doing down here?" "I got lost on my way to the lobby, and I got locked in here." "Do you have a key?" I was shaking, wanting to get out, but he didn't respond about the key. He began to walk toward the stairwell doors, and I followed. When I asked him, "Isn't it right here?" he looked nervous, and even though it was dark, I could see sweat on his forehead and behind his glasses. "No, this way," he said firmly. I continued to follow him, but now I was nervous too. We passed the stairwell door and headed to a darker part of the basement away from the elevators. He seemed unsure of his direction and kept looking around as if he was seeing everything for the first time. We turned a corner and began walking toward the boxes, but I stopped immediately upon realizing something was seriously amiss. This guy didn't know where he was going, and he didn't appear to work at the hotel. "Hey, where are we going?" He turned and said, "This way, just follow me." I knew there weren't any doors by the boxes because I had checked there first, and I'm grateful for whatever gave me the idea. Next, I started screaming as loudly as I could, so loud that I gave myself a headache. The man, who was irritated and covering his ears, yelled back at me, "What are you doing?" "Be quiet," but I can't even recall how long it lasted. Fortunately, the man snapped, and I ran as quickly as I could toward the stairwell doors, hoping they would be open somehow. He didn't run after me. Instead, he just walked behind me, calling me names like stupid and other nice remarks. I was about a few feet from the door when someone suddenly came through my savior, a hotel janitor who had heard my screaming from the stairwell. The janitor asked me who the man was, and I told him I didn't know. I said the man had come in through the door on the other side of the room and pointed to it. The janitor quickly radioed the front desk, telling them he found a child in the basement. The man in the lab coat started arguing with the janitor, saying he was just looking for a bathroom, but the janitor clearly didn't believe him and kept saying things like, "Wait until security gets here and talk to them." I was standing next to him trying to understand what was happening, completely confused. Finally, an employee from the front desk came and took me back up the steps to the lobby where I met my family. They surprisingly didn't know I was missing. I told them what happened, crying and shaking, and they hugged me tightly, thanking the employee again and again for their help. I never got to thank that janitor. Looking back, I don't know who that guy was or what he was doing in the basement, but I do know that the incident involving the girl in the lobby had nothing to do with low blood sugar. I've probably given that day a lot of thought, and the only explanation I can think of is that the door I discovered in the basement led to the city streets, which is where he must have come from. I'm not sure what his intentions were, why he was wearing a lab coat, or why he pretended to know a way out. In all honesty, this could have just been a major misunderstanding, and I chose a terrible moment to get lost. My best friend Celia began telling me stories about strange things that happened in her home when I was in second grade. She seemed worried, and I could tell something was bothering her. One day, she showed me a small hole in the wall of her unfinished basement. The walls were made of bricks or cinder blocks, and the hole was forming in the mortar between them. Over time, the hole grew larger until we were in 4th or 5th grade, and by that time, we could fit most of our arms inside it. It was odd because the hole kept getting deeper but didn't get much wider around this time. Since we were only 10 years old, I fully believed Celia when she told me that she began hearing voices in her basement and thought they were coming from the hole. We frequently had sleepovers on the weekends, which is when I noticed all the strange things about her home. Her family was a little out of the ordinary because they had a lot of animals, at least 6 cats, dogs, and rabbits. For as long as I knew Celia and her animals, there were birds, lizards, snails, frogs, fish, and more. Her cats and dogs would occasionally disappear, and we would later find them standing directly in front of the hole. This began to really frighten us. Celia told me she thought something was living inside the walls and could move around her house using the hole as a way to come out, and I believed her, but I hadn't seen enough to feel as scared as she was at school. She was constantly anxious and stressed, and her teachers and fellow students noticed and were very concerned about her. It seemed like her parents didn't care or didn't believe her, and many people assumed she was just anxious because her older sister had left for college. Since her family loved animals so much, it made sense that Celia's room had a large collection of stuffed animals in all shapes and sizes. On the first night of my stay, we slept in her bed, and when we woke up the following morning, we noticed something odd. All of her stuffed animals, which were typically strewn about the room, had been neatly stacked in a pile about 4 feet high, with each one facing us and staring directly at us. I didn't realize at the time, and I still don't believe now that Celia or anyone else could have moved all those toys. I've always been a very light sleeper, and some of the stuffed animals were on top of a big wardrobe. We both knew that whatever Celia thought was living in the walls must have done this. We carefully put all the animals back in place and didn't tell her parents. I kind of wish we had now, since I was staying for the whole weekend. We went to sleep again in her bed that night, then we woke up around the same time. When it was still dark outside, it must have still been night, we heard a very low creaking sound coming from under us. We knew it was the wooden floor under her bed, just like in a horror movie, and maybe because we were only 10, we thought it would be a good idea to lean over the edge of the bed and look under. As soon as we did, we saw and heard one of the floorboards slam back down. We quickly pulled our heads back up, hugged each other, and cried. I have never been so scared in my life. The next morning, I called my parents and asked them to take me home right away. I refused to ever go back to Celia's house because I was too afraid. Things only got worse for her at school and at home. I don't remember if I ever asked her about what was happening in her house again. Maybe I didn't because I was too scared and we were so young. I only saw Celia twice after that, and it was over 10 years ago. I've never heard from her since, but I've always wondered what happened to her, especially since I know her family still lives in that house today. After so many years, I still remember those moments clearly, and my theory is that there was a man or a group of people secretly living in the walls of her house, watching everything that happened. Since I only saw one board move, I don't think that was how they got into the room. They probably had multiple spots to watch us, so they knew when to move around the house. The hole in the wall was their way of listening to what was going on in the basement and spying on us. When no one was in the basement, they could slip out undetected. As for the stuffed animals, I think they must have been moved by someone who was really disturbed or had a twisted KNE to scare us or mess with her. It seemed as though they enjoyed seeing how much fear they could provoke. My parents' house is right next to a small red house, and our backyard faces the side of that house, which has a wooden deck and 2 big windows out in front. There were always at least 3 cars parked in the driveway or on the street, but no one ever seemed to use them. It was strange because in the 10 years I stayed there, I never saw anyone going in or out of the house, not even to check the mail or take out the trash. Then one evening when I was around 12, I was in the backyard and happened to looked toward the red house through one of the windows, I noticed faint shadows moving on the far wall, almost like people were walking around inside. It caught my attention because it was the only time I ever saw any kind of movement in that house. Then, after a while, when my sister moved out, I took her bedroom. It was a big open room in the basement that had been fixed up nicely. The room had a door with an outdoor stairway leading to the backyard, and there was a small window on the door, and my sister had covered it with a Pulp Fiction poster. But when I moved in, I changed the decorations and put up sheer half curtains instead of the poster. The room was set up so that if I was lying on the bed or sitting on the couch, I could see the door right in front of me. When I first started staying in that room, I noticed that sometimes at night I could hear the sound of leaves crunching in the stairway outside. I thought it was just my cat, who liked to wander around the neighborhood, so I didn't worry about it. But a few weeks later, something happened that made me think differently. So one night, when my parents were away for work, my boyfriend and I were sitting on the couch and talking. Then all of a sudden he froze and stared at the small window on the door. He didn't say a word, but I could tell something had caught his attention. So I asked him what was wrong, and he said, "I just saw a camera flash." At first I laughed it off, thinking he was just imagining things, but as the night went on, I couldn't shake the strange feeling. So when it was time to sleep, I kept glancing at the small gap between the curtains on the door. The stairwell outside was completely dark since there wasn't a light there. If someone was really standing at the bottom of the stairs watching, I wouldn't have been able to tell. Then around 3 o'clock in the morning, I heard the sound of leaves crunching under heavy boots. For some reason, I decided that the best thing to do was to handle it myself, even though I'm only 5 feet 3 inches, and I didn't even bother putting on shoes, and opened the door quickly and looked outside. There was no one in the stairway, so I ran up the stairs into the backyard. That's when I saw him, a man probably in his mid-40s, about 6 feet tall, wearing one of those mechanic jumpsuits. He was just standing there. He was holding an old clunky digital camera that looked like it hadn't been used in years. For a moment, neither of us moved. We just stared at each other, frozen. The way he stood there made my skin crawl. It felt like an eternity before I finally found my voice and shouted, "Hey, what are you doing?" My words startled him, and without saying anything, he spun around and bolted. He ran straight through my backyard toward the red house and disappeared into the darkness. I stood there shaking, trying to process what had just happened. After that night, I never saw any strange camera flashes or heard the sound of boots in the stairwell again, but the thought still haunts me. How many nights had he been standing there in the shadows, silently watching me?